You wake up just before sunrise. Your stomach is empty, not because you skipped breakfast, because breakfast hasn't been invented yet. There are no farms, no wheat fields stretching across the horizon, no baker waking before dawn to knead bread, no fruit orchards planted by human hands, no grocery stores waiting to open. Everything you will eat today is still hiding somewhere in the landscape around you. Some of it is buried beneath the ground. Some of it is hanging from branches. Some of it is swimming through a river. Some of it is trying very hard not to become your dinner. And here's the part almost everyone gets wrong. For nearly 300,000 years, every human being who ever lived survived exactly like this. Agriculture, the thing we now think of as the beginning of civilization, is astonishingly recent. If the entire history of Homo sapiens were compressed into one calendar year, farming would not appear until the final 2 weeks of December. I'm curious, where are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to see how far this story travels. Everything before that, every journey, every invention, every ancestor whose survival eventually led to you, happened without planting a single crop. So what did ancient humans actually eat before farming? The answer is far more surprising than mammoths and berries. And it begins with one of the biggest misunderstandings in all of human history. Let's start with the idea that refuses to die, the caveman diet. The image is familiar. A hunter drags home an enormous animal. Everyone eats meat around a fire. The next morning, they do it all again. Simple, except archaeology keeps telling a completely different story. In 1968, anthropologist Richard B. Lee traveled to the Kalahari Desert to live among the Jew/Hoansi San, one of the last hunter-gatherer societies still practicing a lifestyle that resembles humanity's distant past. Many scientists at the time expected to find people constantly struggling to survive. Instead, Lee discovered something that forced anthropologists to rethink prehistoric life. Plant foods supplied the majority of the community's calories. Not meat, plants. Wild mongongo nuts alone provided enormous amounts of fat, protein, and energy throughout much of the year. The hunters were respected. But the gatherers quietly kept everyone alive. Think about that for a second. For decades, popular culture imagined prehistoric humans as hunters first. Richard Lee's research suggested something much closer to reality. The most reliable food often didn't run away, and the Kalahari wasn't unique. Nearly 40 years later, anthropologist Frank Marlowe spent years studying the Hadza of northern Tanzania. His research, published throughout the early 2000s and brought together in his 2010 book, The Hadza, Hunter-Gatherers of Tanzania, revealed another remarkable pattern. There wasn't a fixed menu. The Hadza changed what they ate as the landscape changed around them. After seasonal rains came berries. During dry months, they dug underground tubers. When bees filled hollow trees with honey, entire days revolved around finding it. When opportunities appeared, they hunted zebra, antelope, baboons, birds, and smaller game. The menu never stayed the same for long, and that's the point. Humans didn't evolve to eat one perfect diet. We evolved to eat whatever the environment offered. That flexibility became our greatest survival advantage. Imagine someone dropped you into that same African landscape tomorrow. No map, no packaged food, no bottle of water, just miles of grassland stretching in every direction. How long would you survive? Probably not very long. Not because there isn't food, because you wouldn't know where it is. That tree with bright fruit, it might feed you or poison you. Those roots beneath your feet, some contain enough carbohydrates to sustain a family. Others contain toxins capable of making you violently ill. Your ancestors didn't inherit supermarkets. They inherited knowledge. Every edible leaf, every poisonous mushroom, every nesting bird, every flowering season, every migration. Knowledge wasn't education. Knowledge was calories, and calories were life. This is something archaeologists have struggled to explain for decades. How did humans spread across deserts, rainforests, mountains, Arctic tundra, and tropical islands when every environment offered completely different foods? The answer came from a surprising realization. Humans weren't specialists. We were generalists. In biology, specialists are incredibly efficient until conditions change. Koalas depend almost entirely on eucalyptus. Giant pandas rely mostly on bamboo. If their favorite food disappears, they have very few alternatives. Humans chose a completely different strategy. If fruit disappeared, dig roots. If roots failed, catch fish. If rivers dried, follow migrating animals. If hunting failed, collect shellfish. If everything else failed, look for honey. Instead of mastering one food, we mastered adaptability itself. That may sound obvious today, but the evidence took decades to uncover. For much of the 20th century, archaeologists believed Ice Age humans lived primarily on meat. Animal bones preserve well. Plant remains usually don't. So the archaeological record appeared heavily biased toward hunting. Then, in 2011, Amanda Henry and an international team of researchers published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that quietly transformed the conversation. Instead of studying weapons, they studied teeth. Specifically, the hardened dental calculus preserved on Neanderthal and early human remains. Inside that ancient plaque, they found microscopic starch grains, tiny fragments of cooked and uncooked plants, evidence that wild grasses, roots, seeds, and underground storage organs had been part of prehistoric diets all along. The meals themselves had vanished tens of thousands of years earlier, but traces of those meals had remained locked inside human mouths, waiting. Sometimes history isn't rewritten by discovering something new. Sometimes it's rewritten by finally looking in the right place. The discoveries didn't stop there. Only a year later, in 2012, archaeologist Karen Hardy and her colleagues published another influential study in the Journal of Human Evolution. Again, ancient teeth told the story. Neanderthals had eaten dates, legumes, grass seeds, even medicinal plants. The old stereotype of prehistoric humans surviving almost entirely on meat became increasingly difficult to defend. The picture was becoming clearer. Our ancestors weren't simply hunters. They were expert foragers, expert fishers, expert scavengers, expert opportunists, and perhaps the greatest opportunist of all was sweetness. Imagine walking through woodland when someone suddenly notices bees disappearing into a hollow tree. Everything stops. Because hidden inside that tree is something almost impossible to find in the prehistoric world. Concentrated sugar, honey. Today you can buy it in seconds. For your ancestors, it was worth climbing dangerous trees, enduring dozens of painful stings, and sometimes risking a fatal fall. Why? Because honey wasn't just delicious, it was one of the richest natural energy sources available anywhere. Frank Marlowe's research among the Hadza found that honey can contribute a substantial portion of annual calories, especially for men during certain seasons. Think about that. The intense human love of sweetness didn't appear because someone invented candy. It evolved in a world where finding sugar was incredibly difficult and unbelievably valuable. Your brain still remembers that world. Every craving has a history. Every appetite tells an evolutionary story. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about prehistoric diets wasn't any single food. It was diversity. Today, according to the Food and Agriculture Organization, just a handful of domesticated crops, wheat, rice, maize, and potatoes, provide most of humanity's calories. Our food system has become incredibly productive, but also remarkably narrow. Before farming, many hunter-gatherers consumed hundreds of different wild species over the course of a year. The landscape itself became their pantry. Spring offered fresh shoots and bird eggs. Summer filled forests with berries and fruit. Autumn covered the ground with nuts packed full of fat. Winter demanded entirely different knowledge. Stored foods, bone marrow, dried meat, and hidden roots waiting beneath frozen soil. The menu changed with every season, so your ancestors changed with it, generation after generation, for nearly 300,000 years, which raises an even bigger mystery. If ancient humans ate plants, nuts, fish, roots, honey, fruit, shellfish, and meat, which of those foods gave our species enough energy to evolve larger brains? Which foods powered the journeys that carried humans across 6 continents? Which meals helped transform a clever African ape into the only species capable of building civilizations? Because the answer isn't simply meat. It isn't simply plants. It involves fire, fat, and one evolutionary breakthrough that may have changed the history of our species forever. Before we continue, I want to hear your thoughts. If you had to survive for 1 month using only foods that existed before farming, what would you look for first? Let me know in the comments. Imagine you're standing beside the carcass of a freshly killed antelope. Your family is hungry. You've spent hours tracking this animal across the grasslands. The hunt is finally over. Now comes the part most people think they understand. You cut away the meat. You carry it home. End of story. Except that isn't what your ancestors did. Not even close. In fact, if you could watch an experienced hunter-gatherer process an animal 50,000 years ago, the first thing that might surprise you is what they reached for first. It probably wasn't the steak. It was the fat. And sometimes, it wasn't even the muscles at all. Let's start with something that completely changed how scientists think about human evolution. For decades, researchers argued about one question. How did humans grow such enormous brains? Your brain makes up only about 2% of your body weight, yet it consumes roughly 20% of your resting energy. It is by far the most expensive organ you own. So where did all that extra energy come from? In 1995, evolutionary anthropologists Leslie Aiello of University College London and Peter Wheeler published a paper in Current Anthropology called the expensive tissue hypothesis. Their argument was revolutionary. Humans didn't simply evolve larger brains. Something else had to shrink to pay the bill. According to their research, our digestive system became shorter and less energy-intensive than those of other great apes. Chimpanzees spend 6 or 7 hours every day chewing raw plants. Gorillas eat enormous quantities of leaves because leaves simply don't contain enough usable calories. Humans took another path. Instead of eating more food, we started eating better food. Food packed with far more energy. That single shift may have helped fuel one of the largest brains ever evolved by a primate. But what exactly was that food? For many years, archaeologists believed they already knew the answer. Meat. Lots of meat. Then the evidence became more complicated. In the 1980s and 1990s, paleoanthropologist Henry Bunn spent years studying animal bones from Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, one of the most important archaeological sites in the world. The bones told an extraordinary story. Stone tools had sliced flesh from carcasses nearly 2 million years ago. Cut marks appeared directly over muscle attachments. Some bones had been smashed open to reach something hidden inside. Bone marrow. Think about that. Imagine holding a heavy stone in your hands. Instead of carefully cutting another piece of meat, you smash open the femur of a large animal. Inside is soft, fatty marrow, rich in calories, rich in nutrients, easy to digest. Your ancestors understood something modern nutrition is only beginning to appreciate. Fat is energy. And in a world where food was never guaranteed, energy meant survival. But there was another organ your ancestors prized even more: the liver, the heart, the kidneys, the brain itself. Today, we call them organ meats. In prehistoric societies, they were often the first parts eaten. Why? Because they were nutritional gold mines. Long before anyone knew what vitamins were, people knew which parts of an animal made them feel strongest. Knowledge didn't come from laboratories. It came from generations of observation, parents teaching children, hunters teaching apprentices, families remembering what worked. This kind of knowledge doesn't survive by accident. It survives because forgetting it could kill you. But here's where the story takes another unexpected turn. Even if meat was incredibly valuable, it still wasn't enough. Think about it. A successful hunt could feed dozens of people, but hunts failed. Sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks. If humans depended entirely on hunting, our species probably wouldn't have survived. Nature needed a backup plan. Fortunately, it had already provided one. Look beneath your feet. Literally. Somewhere beneath the soil lies one of humanity's oldest emergency food supplies: tubers, underground storage organs, wild yams, roots, corms, bulbs, foods hidden from almost every predator except the ones patient enough to dig. For years, anthropologists watched Hadza women carrying simple wooden digging sticks across the Tanzanian savanna. It looked almost ordinary until researchers realized what those sticks represented: insurance. When hunting failed, the ground rarely did. Frank Marlowe documented how underground tubers remained available during seasons when fruit disappeared and game became scarce. The landscape itself stored food beneath the surface. You simply needed to know where to look. Knowledge once again became calories, and that pattern appears almost everywhere scientists have looked. In Australia, Aboriginal communities harvested yam daisies. In North America, indigenous peoples collected camas bulbs. Across Africa, wild tubers provided dependable carbohydrates long before agriculture existed. Different continents, different plants, the same survival strategy: dig. But perhaps no prehistoric food fascinated researchers more than honey. You've probably tasted honey hundreds of times, spread across toast, mixed into tea, drizzled over dessert. Your ancestors experienced it very differently. Imagine walking for hours beneath the scorching African sun when someone suddenly notices bees flying into the hollow trunk of a baobab tree. Everything changes. Children become excited. Adults stop what they are doing because everyone knows what waits inside: thousands of calories suspended in golden liquid. Frank Marlowe's fieldwork among the Hadza found that men often worked together to locate wild bee nests. Sometimes they even relied on an extraordinary partner, a bird called the greater honey guide. For centuries, local communities claimed the bird deliberately led humans toward wild hives. Many scientists dismissed the stories as folklore. Then, in 2016, evolutionary biologist Claire Spottiswoode and her colleagues published research in Science demonstrating that the relationship was real. The honey guide responds to special human calls. It leads people toward bee colonies. Humans open the hive. They take the honey. The bird feeds on the leftover wax and larvae. Two completely different species, cooperating. Neither one invented the partnership. Evolution did. Think about that. Somewhere in Africa, your ancestors weren't just hunting animals. They were communicating with birds. But even honey wasn't available every day, which meant humans kept searching along rivers, coastlines, lakes, and what they found there changed human history. In 2007, archaeologist Curtis Marian began excavating Pinnacle Point on the southern coast of South Africa. His team uncovered compelling evidence that early modern humans were harvesting shellfish roughly 164,000 years ago. That date matters, because Earth was trapped in one of the harshest ice age climates our species had yet experienced. Many inland food sources became unreliable. The ocean didn't. Twice every day, the tide quietly delivered food to the shoreline. Mussels, limpets, shellfish packed with minerals, protein, and omega-3 fatty acids. No dangerous chase required, just careful timing. Marian later suggested that reliable coastal foods may have helped small human populations survive one of the toughest periods in our evolutionary history. Sometimes civilization isn't saved by heroic hunts. Sometimes it's saved by the tide coming in. And then there were insects. Most people watching this probably don't like that idea. Your ancestors almost certainly disagreed. Insects are everywhere. They're rich in fat, rich in protein, available in seasons when larger animals disappear. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that more than 2 billion people still include insects as part of their traditional diets today. That isn't unusual. Our discomfort is. For most of human history, food was judged by one standard. Could it keep you alive? Not whether it looked appetizing. By now you may have noticed something unusual. We've talked about meat, fat, roots, honey, shellfish, insects, fruit, seeds, nuts. Not one of them explains prehistoric diets on its own. And that's exactly the point. There was never one ancient menu. There were thousands. Every valley, every coastline, every mountain, every season, every generation adapted differently. Which brings us to perhaps the biggest surprise of all. If hunter-gatherers had access to such a rich variety of foods, why did humans ever give that up? Why abandon hundreds of wild species? For just a few domesticated crops? It seems like a terrible trade. And in many ways, it was. Because the invention of farming didn't immediately make humans healthier. In fact, the archaeological evidence suggests the opposite. We'll explore that in part 3. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. Which prehistoric food surprised you the most? Bone marrow, wild honey, shellfish, or the fact that humans once cooperated with birds to find food? Let me know in the comments. Imagine you wake up tomorrow morning and every food you've ever known has disappeared. No bread, no rice, no potatoes, no pasta, no cereal, no apples growing in orchards, no chickens raised on farms, no cows standing behind fences. Everything your supermarket sells is gone. Instead, you have an entire landscape in front of you. Thousands of edible plants, wild animals, fish, shellfish, roots hidden beneath the soil, honey hanging inside hollow trees. Which prehistoric food has surprised you the most so far? Honey, bone marrow, or shellfish? I'd genuinely like to know. Now, here's the strange question. If your ancestors already had all of that, why did they invent farming at all? After everything we've discovered, that decision almost feels backwards. Hunter-gatherers ate remarkable variety. They adapted to every environment on Earth. Many archaeologists now believe they enjoyed diets far more diverse than ours. So why replace hundreds of wild foods with just a handful of crops? The answer doesn't begin with food, it begins with climate. Around 11,700 years ago, something extraordinary happened. The last ice age ended. Temperatures rose, glaciers retreated, rainfall patterns stabilized. For the first time in thousands of years, large regions of the planet became predictable. Wild wheat returned to the same valleys. Wild barley covered the same hillsides. Gazelles migrated along familiar routes. The landscape itself became more reliable, and humans noticed. In 1997, geneticist Manfred Huhn and his colleagues published a landmark paper in Science tracing the origins of domesticated einkorn wheat. Using DNA fingerprinting, they concluded that one of humanity's earliest crops most likely originated near the Karakadog Mountains in southeastern Turkey. Not because someone suddenly invented farming overnight, but because generations of hunter-gatherers had already spent thousands of years harvesting wild grain in those same hills. Think about that. Agriculture wasn't created by farmers. It was created by hunter-gatherers who gradually became experts in one particular landscape. The transition took centuries, maybe even millennia. No one woke up one morning and announced, "Today we become farmers." History almost never works like that. But once people began returning to the same places every year, something else changed. They stopped following food. Food started waiting for them, and that simple reversal changed everything. Permanent villages appeared, storage pits filled with grain, stone houses replaced temporary shelters, families grew larger, populations exploded. For the first time in human history, food could be accumulated, and whenever something can be stored, someone eventually controls it. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. For generations, people assumed farming made humanity healthier. More food must mean healthier people, right? The skeletons tell a different story. Beginning in the 20th century, bioarchaeologists started comparing the bones of hunter-gatherers with the first farming communities. Again and again, the same pattern emerged. Early farmers were often shorter. Their bones showed more signs of nutritional stress. Childhood growth frequently slowed. Disease became more common. Why? Because diversity disappeared. Instead of eating hundreds of different foods across the year, many communities suddenly depended on only one or two crops. If wheat failed, everyone suffered. If disease struck the harvest, entire villages starved together. In 1989, anthropologist Mark Nathan Cohen published Health and the Rise of Civilization, bringing together decades of archaeological evidence from around the world. His conclusion challenged one of history's greatest assumptions. The agricultural revolution increased food production, but it often reduced individual health. More calories did not necessarily mean better nutrition. Then, in 2001, archaeologist Clark Spencer Larson expanded that picture in his influential book Bioarchaeology. By examining thousands of ancient skeletons, Larson documented increases in tooth decay, iron deficiency, infectious disease, and repetitive stress injuries after farming became widespread. The evidence came directly from the bones. Hunter-gatherers moved constantly. Farmers repeated the same physical tasks every day: plant, harvest, grind grain, carry water, repeat, year after year, generation after generation. Even their teeth began telling a different story. For most hunter-gatherers, cavities were relatively uncommon. Their diets contained little refined starch and almost no concentrated sugar. Then agriculture arrived. Grains became staples. Natural bacteria inside the mouth suddenly found themselves surrounded by carbohydrates. Tooth decay exploded. One of the clearest examples comes from the archaeological site of Abu Huraira in modern-day Syria. Excavated by Andrew Moore during the 1970s, Abu Huraira preserves one of the world's most remarkable records of the transition from hunting and gathering to farming. The people buried there lived through both worlds. Their skeletons became a timeline. Before agriculture, they hunted gazelle, gathered wild plants, and ate a highly varied diet. After agriculture, their bones reveal increasing evidence of repetitive strain from grinding grain. Many women developed severe arthritis in their knees, hips, shoulders, and lower backs after spending countless hours kneeling over stone grinding slabs. Imagine that. One invention, changing not just civilization, but the shape of the human skeleton itself. History isn't only written in books. Sometimes it's written in joints. And yet, despite all these costs, agriculture spread across the world. Why? Because while hunter-gatherers often lived healthier lives, farmers supported far more people. A single field of wheat could feed many more children than the same area left completely wild. Those children grew into adults. Those adults cleared more land, built more villages, created more food. Population became humanity's greatest advantage. In 2017, political scientist James C. Scott published Against the Grain, a book that challenged another popular assumption. Scott argued that agriculture didn't simply create civilization, it also made people easier to govern. Grain ripens at predictable times. It can be measured, stored, taxed. A field of wheat cannot hide. A patch of wild berries can. According to Scott, the earliest states formed around cereals because cereals made administration possible. Think about what that means. The loaf of bread sitting on your kitchen table today is connected, however indirectly, to the invention of taxation bureaucracy, cities, and eventually nations. Sometimes history begins with something as ordinary as breakfast, but through every change, one thing never disappeared: human adaptability. We still carry the bodies built by hundreds of thousands of years before farming. Your preference for sweet food, your ability to store fat, your attraction to calorie-rich meals, your digestive system, even the microbes living inside your gut, all carry echoes of a prehistoric world. Daniel Lieberman, evolutionary biologist at Harvard University, has spent decades studying this mismatch between ancient biology and modern life. In his 2013 book, The Story of the Human Body, Lieberman argues that evolution never stopped. It simply moves far more slowly than civilization. Our technology transformed in a few thousand years. Our biology did not. Your body still expects uncertainty. Instead, it lives surrounded by abundance. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson hidden inside this story. For nearly 300,000 years, your ancestors survived without supermarkets, without farms, without recipes, without refrigerators, without restaurants, without nutrition labels. They survived because they observed, they experimented, they remembered. Every edible root discovered by one generation became knowledge for the next. Every poisonous berry avoided became another lesson passed around the evening fire. Every successful hunt, every failed harvest, every changing season became part of an enormous library stored not on paper, but in human memory. That library carried our species across Africa, through the Middle East, into Europe, across Asia, over frozen land bridges, and eventually into almost every environment on Earth. Long before books, knowledge was carried by people. And that's the real story of what ancient humans ate before farming. It wasn't one perfect diet. It wasn't endless mammoth steaks. It wasn't constant starvation. It was something much more remarkable: flexibility, curiosity, observation, the willingness to eat whatever the world offered, and the wisdom to remember where to find it again. Every meal your ancestors gathered, every root they dug, every shellfish they collected, every berry they tasted, every hive they climbed, became another small step toward the civilization you live in today. And the next time you walk through a supermarket filled with food from every corner of the planet, remember this: for almost all of human history, your entire menu depended on how well you understood the landscape beneath your feet. Your ancestors didn't survive because the world was generous. They survived because they learned how to read it. Before we finish, I'd love to hear your opinion. If you could spend just one day eating exactly as your ancestors did before farming, would you do it, or would one day be enough? Let me know in the comments.